opened her eyes and wished she hadn't. The sun was shining outside her window in Vancouver, but inside her chest, nothing. No tears, no rage, just a suffocating silence that made her question if she was even alive or just pretending to be. Her phone buzzed with a dozen messages, but she couldn't care less. Coffee tasted like cardboard. Music sounded like static. The mirror showed her face, but she couldn't find herself in it. Just a year ago, she had a career, a partner, a plan. Now, just a bed she didn't want to get out of and a body she wasn't sure she still belonged to. But that's not the part that will haunt you. The part that will stay with you is this. What if the emptiness you fear the most is actually the invitation your soul has been waiting for? What if losing everything was how you start remembering who you really are? If this speaks to something inside you, if you've ever felt like the world kept spinning while you stood still, then you're not alone. I invite you to stay with me through the end of this story. And if this message resonates with you, please subscribe to the channel. It gives me the strength and motivation to keep making these videos, not just for views but for healing. Thank you for being here. Let's begin. Elena opened her eyes and wished she hadn't. The morning sun streamed softly through the window of her apartment in Vancouver, painting golden stripes across the hardwood floor. The city outside was slowly awakening, cars murmuring down the street, a distant dog barking, someone laughing faintly in a nearby hallway. But none of it reached her. Not really. Not in a way that moved anything inside. She wasn't tired. She wasn't sad. She wasn't angry. She was just gone. As if someone had reached inside her chest during the night and gently scooped everything out, leaving behind only a shell that breathed and blinked and existed but didn't live. The silence in the room wasn't peaceful, it was suffocating. She hadn't showered in 3 days. She hadn't responded to texts. Her phone had over a dozen unread messages, blinking quietly like desperate ships in the dark. She ignored them. Even her own reflection in the mirror felt like a stranger, the spark in her eyes gone, the curiosity she used to wake up with missing. The thought crossed her mind with a kind of bitter clarity. I don't recognize my life anymore. It's funny, she thought, how sadness doesn't always announce itself like a storm. Sometimes it tiptoes in like fog, soft, quiet, and everywhere. A year ago, Elena had been someone people admired, a gifted piano teacher with a wait list, a woman with discipline, passion, and plans. She had just finished renovating her studio. She had dreams of hosting retreats, traveling, publishing a book. But somewhere along the line, the melody stopped. Not with a crash, with a fade. Her partner drifted away. Her ambition crumbled into apathy. She started sleeping more, speaking less, caring less. The dangerous part wasn't that she was crying, it was that she was. And this morning was different. Not because something broke, but because nothing did. The emptiness was so normal it terrified her. And in that numbness, one single question rose like a cold wind against her skin. What if this isn't a phase? What if this is who I've become? She sat still, legs curled beneath her, and let the silence say things she had been running from. In the absence of distractions, she finally heard the truth. She didn't know who she was anymore. The realization was sharp but familiar, like a song she used to love but forgot the words to. There were no panic attacks, no tears, no scream for help, only breath, only stillness. Only the quiet horror of watching your own life drift past you like a train you missed while tying your shoes. But beneath that grief something else stirred. A whisper, almost imperceptible. What if this emptiness is not your ending? What if it's the invitation you've been avoiding? She didn't believe it, not fully, but she was too tired to reject it, so she sat. And she listened. And in that moment when she chose not to escape, something ancient, something quiet, something sacred began to move. Not loudly, not suddenly, but enough. Enough to make her wonder if maybe the hollow morning wasn't a mistake. Maybe it was the doorway. She didn't move for a long time. The clock in her kitchen ticked loud enough to feel aggressive. The world around her was stirring, construction noises somewhere, the low hum of traffic. but she remained anchored to the stillness like it was the only thing real. For the first time in months, Alina didn't reach for her phone, didn't scroll to anesthetize herself, didn't try to optimize her morning. Something had broken open, and in the sharp cold of that openness, she felt something unfamiliar pressing in, presence. It wasn't pleasant, not at first. It felt raw, like walking barefoot over forgotten memories. But she let herself stay there, uncomfortably awake. She looked around her apartment and realized just how much of her life had become automated. The minimalist furniture, the untouched books, the forgotten piano, its cover still closed. How many mornings had passed like this? How many days had she played the role of herself so convincingly that even she started to believe it? She whispered out loud, almost involuntarily, "What happened to me?" Not as a cry for pity, but as a sacred inquiry. And somewhere deep within, her soul whispered back, "You stopped listening." Listening to what, though? To herself, to her body, to the quiet ache she had numbed for far too long. That ache had always been there, at the edges of good days, behind the laughter of dinner parties, tucked under the compliments from colleagues. It was the feeling that something was missing even when everything looked right. And now it was center stage. And strangely, it didn't feel like an enemy. It felt like truth. Alina stood, not because she had the energy to, but because her legs felt like moving. She walked barefoot to the window and watched the city breathe. People heading to work, joggers with dogs, a barista through the cafe window steaming milk. It was all so ordinary, so alive, and yet she felt like a ghost inside it all. That wasn't new, but what was new was that she wasn't running from it anymore. She placed her hand on the cool window pane and closed her eyes. "I'm still here," she whispered. "I don't feel like me, but I'm still here." And then came the tears. Soft, silent, cleansing. They came not as breakdown, but as permission. As if her body had been holding them in reserve, waiting for the exact moment she'd stop pretending she didn't need to feel anything at all. This wasn't depression. It wasn't grief. It was something harder to define, the recognition of loss without a name. She had lost her connection to herself. And that, more than any job, any relationship, any title, was what hurt. She sat down at the edge of her bed, this time not in paralysis but with presence. Her fingers traced the fabric of the duvet like it mattered. She noticed her breath, shaky, shallow, but real. And then she reached for an old notebook. Not the fancy planner, not the 5-year goal tracker, just a plain, weathered journal with pages half filled and abandoned. She didn't write anything profound. She just wrote, "I don't know where I'm going, but I know I don't want to go back to who I was pretending to be." It wasn't poetry, but it was honest. She flipped the page, wrote again. "Maybe the emptiness isn't asking me to fill it. Maybe it's asking me to sit inside it and listen." She paused, exhaled, and in that breath something loosened. There's a kind of power in admitting you do know, a kind of sacred clarity in surrendering to the truth that your old tools don't work anymore. Alina didn't know what was next, but she knew what was over, the running. She had spent so long trying to distract herself into feeling alive, through relationships, through productivity, through performing wellness. But no matter how many crystals she bought, how many wellness podcasts she consumed, how many green juices she drank, the truth never left. She felt empty. And now she wasn't afraid to say it out loud. Because maybe, just maybe, that emptiness wasn't a void. Maybe it was space. Space for something real to be born. She didn't try to meditate, didn't try to breathe a certain way. She just existed. And for the first time in a long while, that felt like enough. The sky outside had shifted, a slow cloud cover rolling in from the mountains. The light in her apartment softened. And as she wrapped herself in a blanket and stared at the window, one final thought rose like morning fog lifting off a cold lake. "I thought I had nothing left, but I still have me, and maybe that's where I begin." That afternoon, Alina didn't do much. She didn't clean the kitchen, though the dishes called to her with silent judgment. She didn't answer emails, though deadlines had long since passed. She didn't return her friend's voicemail, which had arrived with all the cheerful energy she used to fake. Instead, she let herself be slow, deliberate, almost primitive. She brewed tea not because she wanted it, but because the act of waiting for water to boil felt meaningful, like the clinking of her ceramic mug had something to teach her. The steam rising from the cup didn't offer comfort so much as it gave her something real to watch, something warm, something that reminded her that change, even in water, begins with stillness and heat. She sat by the window again, curled her fingers around the cup, and let her breath match the rhythm of the steam. For the first time in ages, she wasn't trying to feel better. She was just feeling, whatever this was. And in that quiet hour, without Instagram quotes or inspirational audio, a memory rose. A small one, barely significant. She remembered being 17, sitting in her parents' garage, playing Chopin alone after everyone had gone to bed. The air had smelled of pine and dust. Her fingers had danced not because someone was listening, not because she had a recital coming up, but because something inside her needed to be heard. She remembered the ache in her chest, the beautiful kind. The kind that made her feel more alive, not less. That memory didn't hurt. It felt sacred. And what stung now wasn't that she had lost her talent. She hadn't. It was that she had stopped playing for herself. Somewhere along the line, the music had turned into a product, a service, a job, a mask. Now here in this hollow afternoon, she realized, maybe it wasn't her soul that was empty. Maybe it was just buried. The truth hurt in the way sunlight hurts your eyes after hours in a dark room. She winced against it but didn't run. She let it land. She let it stay. And suddenly she saw her emptiness not as a signal of loss but as a sacred pause. A clearing. A wild, untamed place in the middle of her life where something new might one day grow. And maybe it wasn't time to plant anything yet. Maybe it was just time to sit in the field and acknowledge that the old crops had died. She didn't need a plan. She didn't need to come back stronger. She didn't need to declare a reinvention or post a motivational caption. What she needed was permission to be here now without apology, to be soft and slow and undone. She didn't have much, but she had a body, a breath, a quiet apartment, a cup of tea, and somewhere deep beneath the noise a whisper that said, "This is not the end. This is the beginning, but only if you're brave enough to stay." That evening, something remarkable happened. Elena didn't turn on the lights. She let the room grow dim around her, let the gray dusk seep in like a gentle tide. The corners of her apartment softened in the dark, no longer asking to be cleaned or organized. And in the shadows, she felt strangely safe. There's a peculiar comfort that comes when you finally stop trying to brighten everything, when you let things be dim, be quiet, be what they are. As the day surrendered into night, she found herself doing something she hadn't done in a very long time, nothing at all. No television, no scrolling, no pacing, no glass of wine to dull the ache, just her in the stillness. It wasn't graceful. She shifted a lot, picked at her cuticles, adjusted the blanket over her lap 6 times, but she stayed. And somewhere in that awkward sitting something shifted, not outside her, inside. She realized that for the first time in what felt like years, she was allowing life to catch up to her, to land, to make contact. And it wasn't just grief that showed up. It was beauty too, subtle, flickering, and real. The shape of her bookshelf silhouetted in soft light, the rustle of a tree outside her window, her own breath still moving in and out, even though everything else felt paused. That's when she began to understand something ancient. This emptiness was not dead space. It was sacred ground, the in-between place where the old self decomposes and the new self hasn't yet emerged. And like all sacred places, it demanded reverence, not control, not distraction, not escape. She whispered aloud to the darkness, "I'm not trying to get through you tonight. I'm just going to sit with you." And to her own surprise, she meant it. She didn't sleep much that night. But it wasn't insomnia, it was watching. Something was awake in her, and it wasn't anxiety this time. It was awareness. Not the loud, buzzing kind that leads to overthinking, but the quiet kind that made her notice the pattern of light under her door, the rhythm of her breath, the distant sound of rain starting against the roof. Every sound felt like a message. Every silence felt like presence. Somewhere around 3 a.m. she sat up in bed and did something she hadn't done in years. She prayed, not to a God she could picture, not for answers, not for a fix, just for connection. She whispered, "If someone's listening, I'm here. I don't know what's next, but I'm willing to stay until it arrives." And for the first time in months she felt something. Not joy, not clarity, but company. In the days that followed, Alina didn't transform overnight. This isn't that kind of story. She still ignored messages, still avoided the grocery store, still forgot to shower twice. But something had shifted, not in her behavior but in her relationship to the silence. She stopped fighting it, stopped fearing it. She made space for it. She started calling it her sacred pause, a time when she wasn't being productive, wasn't healing, wasn't working toward anything, just existing, just listening, just breathing into a space she used to run from. She began to take short walks again, not to exercise but to remember what the sky looked like. She left her phone at home, not to be disciplined, but to be undistracted. She found herself standing on a bridge one morning, watching the current below, and thought, "This is me. I'm not stuck. I'm just in motion I can't see yet." And in that moment, for the first time in what felt like forever, she smiled. Not because everything was okay, but because she realized that it didn't have to be. A week later, Alina woke up before the alarm. Not because she had somewhere to be, but because her body wanted to greet the day. It was still early. The kind of early that feels like the earth is still whispering, not quite ready to be loud again. She sat up slowly, listened. The silence was still there, but something had changed. It no longer felt empty. It felt spacious. Like something sacred had been swept clean, not erased, but cleared of performance, of pretending, of who she thought she had to be. And now there was room for something else, something honest. She didn't know what that was yet, but she was no longer afraid of not knowing. She got up, made tea, lit a candle, not to be spiritual, not to be seen, just because the flame made the room feel alive. And then, without thinking, she walked over to her old upright piano, ran her fingers along the dusted keys. No audience, no lesson plan, just her, and the silence. She sat down, breathed in, breathed out, and then played a single note. It rang out soft and warm like a bell calling her home. Her shoulders dropped, her breath slowed. She let her fingers find the next note, then the next. There was no structure, no melody, just presence. The piano didn't ask her to be better. It simply asked her to show up, and she did, not as the Alina with it all figured out, but as the one who had learned to stay, to wait, to listen. She played until the room was full of sound, until she cried without shame, until the silence inside her wasn't something she feared, but something she had learned to respect. And in that moment, Alina realized something she would carry with her for the rest of her life. The hollow mourning wasn't the beginning of her end. It was the moment she finally stopped abandoning herself. She hadn't been broken, she had been becoming. And this was only the first note. It was almost spring in Vancouver when Alina felt the first pull to leave the apartment again, not just for groceries or walks, but for something deeper, something unnamed. The city had begun its quiet thaw. Trees still bare, but the wind was softer now, less like resistance, more like invitation. The mornings arrived a little earlier, the air no longer sharp with winter's edge. Alina stood by her window, watching a single crow land on the roof across from hers, and felt it in her chest. Something is ending. But instead of sadness, she felt curiosity. There had been a time, not long ago, when the idea of things ending filled her with panic. The end of a relationship, the end of a career path, the end of a version of herself she didn't know how to let go of. But now, that fear was softening. Like a sweater unraveling, stitch by stitch. It didn't feel like loss anymore. It felt like space. It was on a Tuesday morning when she packed a small bag and caught a flight to Kyoto, a city she had visited once in her 20s, back when she still believed that joy was something you earned through productivity. She remembered the cherry blossoms, the quiet elegance of temples, the way the streets hummed with a kind of sacred routine. This time, she wasn't going for beauty. She was going to say goodbye, to what she wasn't sure yet. But something inside her had already begun the leaving. She stayed in a simple guest house on the edge of town, where the floor creaked with every step, and the windows let in the kind of light that made everything feel temporary. Outside, the cherry trees hadn't bloomed yet, just tight buds, delicate, restrained, waiting. It matched her perfectly. There was a strange relief in seeing things not yet opened, a permission, a patience. Every morning, she walked the narrow streets without headphones, letting the quietness of the city wash over her like a poem with no need to be interpreted. She visited a Zen garden one afternoon, gravel meticulously raked, stones arranged with deliberate mystery. And there, in that still space, the truth hit her in the chest. Nothing in this world stays the same. And that's not a flaw, it's the design. She sat on the wooden deck and watched the wind slowly rearrange the lines in the sand. No one rushed to fix it. No one panicked. The imperfection was allowed, honored even, and in that she saw a reflection of her own life. She had spent so many years trying to preserve what could never be preserved. The closeness of people who were drifting, the identity she built out of performance, the version of her life that once fit and now suffocated. But here, in this garden, surrounded by quiet truths, she began to see it clearly. Permanence was the illusion, attachment was the chain, and letting go was the only path to peace. That night, she walked alone beneath the faint glow of paper lanterns strung along a narrow alley near Jin. The rain had come softly, making the cobblestones slick and shining, and she found herself moving slowly, reverently, as if each step was part of some silent ritual. People passed by with umbrellas, laughter echoing from tucked-away restaurants, but she was in her own space now, untouched, listening, remembering. In her pocket she carried a photo, worn, folded too many times. It was her and Michael, her former partner, standing on a beach in Oregon, grinning into the wind like nothing would ever touch them. It was taken 4 years ago. She hadn't looked at it in a long time, but today she needed to. She stopped under the awning of a small bookstore and took it out. The memory didn't hurt the way it used to. It no longer brought a lump to her throat or the heat of regret in her chest. It simply was a moment that had happened, a truth that had passed, a season that had ended, and for the first time she didn't try to resurrect it. She didn't wish it back. She didn't mourn the person she was in that picture. She simply whispered, "Thank you," folded it gently and let it go right there in the stream beside the temple bridge. The current took it slowly, not with drama, not with urgency, just with the same quiet grace life always uses when it's ready to carry something away. Alina stood there for a long time after the paper had vanished from sight. She wasn't crying, but she felt cracked open in the best way, like a tightly sealed jar that had finally been allowed to breathe. The next morning, she woke to the soft pink bloom of the first cherry blossoms. No announcement, no grand transformation, just small explosions of softness along the branch. She stared at them from her window for almost an hour, drinking tea she didn't finish, letting her chest swell and soften with something she hadn't felt in a long time: acceptance. Not the passive kind that comes from defeat, but the sacred kind that comes when you realize you were never supposed to hold on so tightly. She thought about how desperately she had once tried to make things last, how every ending had felt like a failure, every shift like a betrayal. But now she saw it. It wasn't failure. It was flow. It wasn't betrayal. It was transformation. The Buddhist temples she visited that week all carried the same subtle message carved into their silence. What is born will end. What ends creates space. And in that space, life begins again. It was there, sitting cross-legged on a weathered floor in a moss-covered temple, that she finally understood why she had been so tired for so long. It wasn't life that exhausted her. It was resistance. When Alina returned to her guest house that evening, She didn't feel like the same woman who had arrived days before, clutching her sadness like a wound that wouldn't close. She had no answers, no revelations to write down, but something had shifted. Not loudly, not visibly, but irrevocably. There was a softness in her bones now, a gentle surrender in the way she moved, breathed, even sat with herself. She no longer needed certainty. She no longer feared endings, because something inside her had finally learned. Forever was never the point. She spent her final morning in Kyoto sitting beneath a cherry tree, now fully in bloom. The petals fell like whispers across her journal, like a reminder that beauty was made sacred not by how long it stayed, but by how deeply it was noticed while it was here. She closed her eyes, letting the wind braid through her hair, and smiled, not the performative kind, but the kind that starts in the stomach and rises slowly, gently, like a candle being lit from within. For so long she had believed the lie that life was meant to be held still, that love was only real if it lasted, that meaning only mattered if it was permanent. But now she understood something deeper, something more tender. The sacred is not in the duration. The sacred is in the depth, in the presence, in the letting go, and so she did. She let go of the need to preserve. She let go of the fantasy of permanence. She let go of the version of herself who couldn't bear change. And in the space that opened, something breathtaking entered: trust. Not in life being predictable, not in people staying, not in anything staying the same, but in herself. In her ability to feel, to stay awake, to let go when it was time. As the plane lifted off the tarmac days later, leaving Japan behind in soft clouds and golden light, Alina didn't feel sad. She felt light. Not because she had erased her past, but because she had finally set it down. She watched the earth fall away below her, the cities and rivers and stories that weren't hers anymore, and placed her hand gently on her heart. "I don't need everything to last," she whispered. "I just want to be here while it's mine." And with that she closed her eyes and let the sky carry her forward. Part 3. Sculpting the real self, subtracting to rebuild. Florence greeted her not with the glamour she expected, but with weight, an ancient stillness that clung to the air like oil paint dried into stone. The moment Alina stepped off the train, the city seemed to breathe differently. Slower, denser. Every cobbled street, every chipped fresco, every shadowed archway seemed to whisper one thing: what endures is what has been carved, not painted over. She hadn't planned to come here. Florence was supposed to be a layover, a pause between returning home and figuring out what home even meant now. But when she wandered into a small square behind the Basilica of Santa Croce and saw an old man hunched over a block of marble, carving with his back to the world, something inside her stopped moving. Not just slowed, stopped. She watched for nearly 20 minutes unnoticed, transfixed. There was no music, no audience, no plaque of explanation. Just the steady chipping of steel against stone, echoing through the cold Florentine air like an ancient heartbeat. She came back the next day, and the next. By the third visit, the sculptor finally looked up. His eyes were cloudy but direct. His accent was thick Tuscan, his English limited, but enough for him to gesture toward a stool beside him and say, "Sit. You see what I do." His name was Luca, a former gallery artist who had gone nearly blind in one eye and now worked only with his hands and intuition. He didn't believe in perfection. He believed in removal. A sculpture, he told her in slow, deliberate syllables, is not made by adding. It is made by taking away. I don't make the woman inside the stone. I free her from what is not her. That line echoed through Alina for days. She wrote it on napkins, scrawled it into her journal, whispered it to herself in the mirror. I don't need to become more. I need to remove what is not me. For so long she had measured her worth by accumulation. Degrees, clients, roles, relationships, certifications. Even in her healing, she had tried to add peace, add meaning, add mindfulness. But Florence was teaching her something older than any self-help book, something ancient and almost uncomfortable. The real work is in unbecoming, unbecoming the pleaser, unbecoming the achiever, unbecoming the woman who couldn't say no, unbecoming the one who performed calmness while quietly burning. Day after day, she returned to the studio. She didn't touch a chisel, Luca wouldn't allow it. Instead, she watched, studied, listened. She learned that each block of marble was different. Some resisted, some cracked, some surrendered gently, like people, Luca said, tapping the stone. You must not force. You must wait and listen. In that small studio on a back street of Florence, Alina began to let go of the idea that healing needed to be graceful. She saw Luca's hands blister. She watched him curse under his breath when a chip broke wrong. She saw him sit still for 20 minutes, doing nothing but breathing in front of the stone. Sometimes, he said, what you take away today is not what you wanted to take. But it was what needed to go. That line hit her in the ribs. She thought about all the things life had taken from her over the past 5 years. Her relationship, her confidence, her hunger, her direction. And suddenly she wondered, what if those weren't losses? What if they were removals? What if life had been sculpting me all along? Florence turned into 3 weeks. She extended her stay, rented a small apartment above a gelato shop, and spent most afternoons walking the bridges alone. She journaled less but felt more. She smiled more often but didn't try so hard to be understood. She stopped explaining herself. She stopped answering texts that felt performative. She even started saying "I don't know" with a kind of power she'd never known she could possess. One morning, as the sun broke in soft gold across the Arno River, she realized something terrifyingly liberating. She no longer wanted to go back to who she was before. That woman, while strong and capable, had also been armored, polished, pleasing. That woman had been praised for her balance, her optimism, her resilience, but only because no one had seen how much of herself she'd buried beneath that shine. And now she didn't want to shine, she wanted to be seen for real, unfinished, in process, with edges, with texture, like marble. One rainy afternoon, Luca placed her hand gently on the half-formed bust of a woman's face. He said only 2 words, "She's you." Alina touched the curve of the cheekbone, the rough lines where the form was still emerging, and something inside her softened so completely she thought she might fall apart. But she didn't. She stood still, hand on the stone, tears silent, heart open. Because for the first time she wasn't trying to be finished. She was simply becoming. Part 4. Kindness in the storm, meeting pain with loving awareness. Alina didn't return to Vancouver immediately after Florence. Instead, she booked a flight to California and followed a strange, quiet pull down the Pacific coast. There was no plan, no itinerary. Just a small beach town called Santa Cruz she once heard someone describe as a place where even the waves seemed to be healing. That was all the reason she needed. She arrived with only a backpack, her worn journal, and a tired heart. The ocean was louder than she remembered. It roared, not like an enemy but like a truth no longer willing to be ignored. The sound of it followed her into her sleep, and for the first time in months her dreams weren't fragmented or blank, they were full. Not of visions or symbols, but of feelings she had long exiled. On her 3rd day, she wandered into a small community center near the boardwalk, drawn by a handwritten sign taped to the door. Group circle for anyone who feels too much. That was it. No name, no therapist's title, no marketing, just a sentence. And somehow that was all it took. She stepped inside. There were no chairs arranged in perfect symmetry. Just beanbags, floor cushions, and a circle of people who looked like they, too, had grown tired of pretending. There was a man with kind eyes and worn jeans. A young woman in her 20s clutching a stone in her palm. A couple in their 50s who held hands in silence. No one looked particularly broken, but no one looked untouched. They welcomed her with a nod, not the kind that demands performance, but the kind that says, "We recognize you. We've been where you are." The facilitator was a woman in her 60s named Marla. She spoke slowly, like each word had weight. "We don't fix people here," she said gently, "we witness them." That sentence alone nearly made Alina cry. Over the next 2 hours, each person shared, fragments mostly. One spoke of a son who no longer called, another of a body that no longer felt familiar. A third admitted she no longer knew how to feel anything at all. When it came time for Alina to speak, she almost said, "I'm fine." The reflex was there, strong and immediate, but something inside her cracked. She looked at the floor, then at her hands. Then said softly, "I don't think I know how to be with my pain unless I'm trying to escape it." Silence followed, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with presence. No one jumped in to reassure her. No one offered clichés. No one tried to fix her. Instead, Marla leaned forward, voice low and warm, and said, "What if pain doesn't want to be solved? What if it just wants to be seen?" And those words unlocked something ancient in Alina. She had spent her whole life trying to outsmart pain, to outrun it, numb it, intellectualize it, prove that she was above it, stronger than it. But sitting here, cross-legged among strangers and salt air, she realized pain didn't want to be conquered. It wanted kindness. In the days that followed, Alina kept coming back, not because the group made her feel good, but because, for the first time, she didn't feel alone in the hard parts. She met a man named Jorge who shared how his grief over losing his wife came not in waves, but in echoes. "Some days," he said, "I open the fridge and cry because she used to keep the grapes in the top drawer." Alina had never known that kind of loss, but she knew the ache, the unexpected sob, the way certain silences felt like screams. Then there was Lily, who admitted one day in a voice like cracked porcelain, "I feel guilty for being sad. Like I should be grateful. I have everything I'm supposed to want." And Alina had never nodded so hard in her life. She too had felt the burden of undeserved sadness, of feeling broken in a beautiful room, of grieving nothing she could name. And each time someone cried, no one turned away. They didn't rush to hand over tissues or say, "It'll get better." They simply stayed, because sometimes staying is the most radical form of love. One evening, Alina lingered after group. The sky was gold with the kind of light that made everything look like forgiveness. She sat on the porch steps, watching the ocean far in the distance. Marla came and sat beside her, said nothing for a while, then asked, "What's the hardest part right now?" Alina thought for a long time, then said, "The fact that I don't even feel like I deserve to be this sad." Marla nodded, looked out toward the setting sun, and said, "You don't have to earn your sadness, Alina. You only have to let it be real." That night, Alina wrote a letter she never intended to send. She addressed it to the girl she used to be, the one who was always smiling, always performing strength, always swallowing grief like it was some shameful secret. She wrote, "You don't have to carry it all. You never did. You're allowed to be held too. You're allowed to rest." She read it aloud to herself, twice, then folded it and placed it inside her journal like a piece of herself she was ready to welcome home. Santa Cruz became a kind of temple, not because it was calm, but because it was honest. Here, she didn't chase happiness. She practiced presence. She took long walks by the shoreline and let the wind teach her how to stay grounded even while everything moved. She wrote every day, not about progress but about permission. She scribbled in big letters, "I don't have to be okay to be worthy of love. I don't have to hide the messy parts. Pain is not weakness. Pain is the part of me that's still awake." She started practicing something Marla called loving awareness, not a technique, not a posture, but a way of relating to everything inside with gentleness. When fear came, she said, "I see you." When shame crept in, she said, "You're not the enemy." When numbness returned, she wrapped it in stillness instead of judgment. It was slow, imperfect, tender, and it worked, not like a fix but like a reunion. When it was time to leave, she hugged every member of the circle. Not all goodbyes need words, and this one didn't. She walked alone down the beach that final morning, shoes in hand, sand cold against her soles. The ocean was wild that day, noisy, crashing, alive. And for the first time in years, she didn't want to tame it. She just wanted to listen. She stood at the edge of the water, arms crossed, breathing deeply. And then quietly she whispered to the wind, "Thank you for not rushing me, because healing doesn't need to be fast. It just needs to be real." And in that storm of sadness and softness, Alina had found the most radical kindness of all. The kind she had learned to give herself. Part 5. The Power of Sacred Simplicity. The cabin was smaller than she expected. A single room tucked between old maple trees in Vermont, with a creaky porch, a wood stove that coughed more than it warmed, and a kettle that whistled like it had stories to tell. Alina found it by accident, or maybe not. It was an old retreat center's guest house, long forgotten by tourists, now only listed on a niche website under the title, "A Place to Be Alone Without Being Lonely." That description landed in her chest like a prayer, so she booked it. No plans, no expectations, just the next step on a journey that had slowly transformed from healing to remembering. The first night was difficult, too quiet, too honest. No Wi-Fi, no distractions, no buzzing notifications to prove she was still connected to the world. Just the soft crackle of firewood and the sound of her own thoughts, no longer muffled by modern noise. She sat by the window and stared into the woods as shadows stretched across the snow like forgotten memories. There was nothing spectacular to see, and that was the point. The morning arrived with slow, gray light, no schedule, no urgency. Alina stood barefoot on the cold wooden floor and listened, to the stillness, to the creaks of the cabin, to the heartbeat of the moment itself. And for some reason she couldn't explain, she began sweeping the floor. Not because it was dirty, not because she needed to, but because her body wanted to move gently, back and forth. Wooden broom against wooden boards. The rhythm was meditative, soothing, like a lullaby for her nervous system. She didn't know it yet, but that would become her first ritual. One of many. Each day, Alina began to build what she would later call her sacred simplicity. She wasn't chasing progress anymore. She wasn't trying to fix herself. She was tending to the smallest parts of her life like they were altars. She started every morning with the same sequence: boil water, pour tea, watch the steam, open the window, let in the air, breathe. Say out loud to no one, "I'm still here." That was it, and it changed everything. The days blurred in the best way, no productivity, just presence. She made oatmeal with cinnamon and apples. She lit candles before sunset. She walked slowly through the trees, hands in her coat pockets, not looking for signs or revelations, just noticing. The way the snow melted in patches, the way birds returned in pairs, the way the sun kissed the frost and made it glitter. It was all so normal, but it didn't feel small. It felt holy. She wrote in her journal without trying to be wise. She sketched leaves and tree bark. She hummed to herself. She began cooking more, not to master recipes, but to feel textures in her hands again: dough, herbs, butter melting in a pan. It was therapy without the labels, healing without the goal. One morning she found herself folding her laundry with care, pressing each towel like it was worthy of reverence. And as she moved, she whispered aloud, "This is my temple now. Not the cabin, not the forest, but her life. The ordinary pieces of it, the quiet gestures, the repetition." She remembered something Marla had once said in Santa Cruz: ritual is repetition with reverence. And now she understood it. Sweeping was a prayer. Boiling water was an offering. Sitting by the window at dusk was a meditation. Not because they were glamorous, but because she chose to do them with her whole heart. As the days turned to weeks, Alina noticed something else. Peace didn't come from doing more. It came from doing less, with more presence. There was a kind of clarity that arrived when she stopped trying to perform transformation. She didn't need a breakthrough. She needed breakfast. She needed to stretch, to sit in a chair and listen to the wind tap the glass and not need to name what it meant. That winter in Vermont became a season of radical slowness. And in that slowness, she discovered truths she had never heard in the noise of her old life. That stillness doesn't mean nothing is happening. That boredom is just presence without stimulation. That joy doesn't need to be thrilling. It can be soft. Sometimes it came as she watched a flame dance inside a candle. Other times when she wrapped herself in a blanket fresh from the line. But most often it came from silence. Not the silence of lack, the silence of enough. One afternoon, she visited a small bookstore in town and found a second-hand copy of a book by Thich Nhat Hanh. The pages smelled like paper and rain. She sat on the porch, reading slowly, and underlined a single line. Drink your tea slowly and reverently, as if it is the axis on which the world Earth revolves. That sentence stayed with her. Every evening afterward she lit a candle, made tea, and sat in silence, not to do anything, not to reflect, just to be. Just to sip, just to breathe. And somehow that ritual became her anchor when anxiety stirred, when loneliness passed through, when old patterns knocked on the door. She came back to that cup, to that flame, to that sacred simplicity. There were no grand epiphanies in that cabin, but there were shifts, small ones. She no longer checked the mirror with fear. She started writing letters to friends, not emails, not texts, letters with ink and envelopes and stamps. She stopped apologizing for not replying immediately. She stopped explaining her solitude. And one day, without trying, she picked up her old travel guitar and sang to herself for the first time in years. Not a performance. Not nostalgia, just breath and melody and memory. It was imperfect, but it was hers. And that, she realized, was the point. This wasn't about becoming someone new. It was about remembering the rhythm of her own life and choosing to live it gently, one sacred, ordinary, quiet moment at a time. Part 6. Flow, not form, seeing yourself as a river. Sedona was unlike any place Alina had ever stepped foot in. The red rocks didn't rise, they reached. Upward, outward, boldly unapologetic in their ancientness. There was a pulse in the earth here, something older than cities, than countries, than names. When she drove into the valley that first morning, windows down, desert air wrapping around her face like a whisper, Alina felt something stir that hadn't moved in a very long time. Not joy, not sadness, something else. Wildness. The kind that doesn't roar but hums softly beneath the ribs, reminding you that you're not meant to be square, that you too are nature. She checked into a small adobe inn just off the highway. Nothing fancy, but the windows opened wide and the sky filled half the room each morning. No noise, no schedule, just the sun rising blood orange over the rocks and the wind that carried silence like a second language. She didn't come here to find answers. She came to unshape herself. Back in Vermont, she had simplified her days, stripped life down to sacred rituals. But now she needed something more radical, not just slower living but softer being. Her therapist had once asked her, "Who are you when you're not being useful?" That question haunted her, because she had always been someone, a teacher, a partner, a fixer, a survivor, someone reliable, someone grounded, someone people leaned on even when she was the one quietly collapsing. Now, here in the desert, she wasn't anyone. She wasn't known. She didn't have to be helpful. She didn't have to be healed. She just had to exist under this giant, burning sky and let herself melt. And so she did. She started hiking each morning, not with goals, not to count steps, but just to wander. Sometimes she followed a trail. Other times she wandered off it. The desert didn't ask her to be precise. It only asked her to pay attention. The rocks glowed like fire. Lizards darted across hot stone. The air changed as the sun climbed from soft and sleepy to sharp and assertive. Every day the landscape looked the same and completely different. That was the lesson. Even the land changes, Alina thought. Even what seems solid shifts. Even I, who once clung to identity like it was air, am allowed to evolve. She began to see her reflection differently, not as a fixed story, but as a river, a process, a motion, not a definition. She met a woman named Clara on her fourth day, a soft-voiced artist who ran a tiny studio behind a crystal shop. Clara painted water. Only water. Rivers, lakes, rain. Because it never stays the same, she explained. And neither do we. They talked long into the evenings about shape-shifting, about femininity not as an image but a rhythm, about how survival once demanded control and how healing now asked for surrender. One afternoon, Clara said, "Maybe the reason you feel empty is because the container you built can no longer hold who you're becoming." That hit Alina like thunder. She had been trying to fit herself back into old dreams, old definitions, even old healing journeys. But what if she was no longer that woman? What if she wasn't broken, just bigger than before? That night, Alina wrote in her journal, "Stop trying to return to the river you once were. You've become the floodplain now." Over the following weeks, she let go of trying to find herself. She stopped asking big questions, stopped journaling with intensity, stopped trying to name everything she felt. Instead, she sat with it all, the confusion, the drifting, the softness. She cooked when she felt like it, read poetry by the window, listened to music she didn't understand but made her cry. And every morning she walked barefoot into the creek near her inn and stood still in the icy water. At first, it shocked her. Then it stilled her. Then it clarified her, not in words but in sensation. The creek didn't care who she had been last year. It only asked her to be here now and let go. Let go of being good. Let go of being certain. Let go of holding still when everything inside you is moving. Because we are not statues. We are not resumes. We are not moments frozen in time. We are movement. We are breath. We are rivers. On her last morning in Sedona, Alina climbed one of the highest rocks before sunrise. She brought no phone, no water, just a blanket and her breath. The wind whipped through her hair as the sky bloomed with color. She closed her eyes and whispered, "I don't need to be who I was." And just like that, something inside her unclenched. Not everything had to be decided. Not everything had to be healed. She could move forward unformed, and that would be enough. Part 7. Sanctuary of Silence, Rebuilding the Inner Temple. The silence wasn't what she feared. It was what she had been unknowingly craving for years. When Alina stepped out of the van that brought her up the narrow mountain road, the air felt different. Thinner, cleaner, like it hadn't been touched by noise in a long time. The retreat center was nestled high above the pines in Northern California, a scattering of cabins and wooden halls surrounding a meditation hall shaped like a great wooden bowl. No mirrors, no clocks, no phones, no names, just silence. It was called the sanctuary, though no one there spoke the word aloud. There were signs posted in soft calligraphy around the grounds. "Speak only if it rises from the deepest stillness. You are not here to improve. You are here to remember." That first night, Alina sat on the edge of her cot, staring at the blank wall of her room. There was no artwork, no stimulation. Just wood, light, breath. She placed her hand on her chest and noticed for the first time in days her own heart, not metaphorically, literally, the thump, the rhythm, the reminder you are still here. She didn't know yet that silence would become her most sacred teacher. The days at the sanctuary flowed without structure. There were meditation periods, but they weren't required. Meals were taken in silence, eaten slowly, with gratitude. Every bowl washed with care, every movement deliberate. It was like living in a world where everything had weight again. Alina struggled the first few days, not because it was hard, but because it was unfamiliar. Her mind, long used to spinning and solving, now screamed in the absence of distraction. Thoughts arose like waves she couldn't predict. What are you doing with your life? You're wasting time. You'll be forgotten. You're nothing without your work. But she didn't run. She didn't reach for answers. She just watched them rise and fall. A monk in simple brown robes passed her in the corridor one morning and offered a small bow. No words, just presence. And in that moment she felt something powerful. I don't need to be impressive to be seen. I only need to be here. Each day, Alina walked the perimeter path around the center's edge, where the trees opened to reveal sky. She didn't listen to music. She didn't pray for clarity. She simply walked and noticed. The way the pine needles whispered beneath her shoes, the scent of earth after fog, the way birds landed, paused, flew again, effortless. And slowly she began to feel it in her own body. The temple wasn't the building, it was her. The silence wasn't outside, it was within. Every breath was a bell, every step was a chant, every moment holy. By the end of the first week, she stopped needing to write. Her journal remained closed, not because she didn't have anything to say, but because there was nothing to explain. The thoughts that once felt so urgent had softened. The guilt, the grief, the ache of being misunderstood all had faded into the background, like leaves falling off a tree that no longer needed them. She found herself sitting on the meditation cushion each morning, not to achieve stillness, but to merge with it. Some days she cried, quiet tears that slid down her cheeks without resistance, not pain, not sadness, just release, just softness, like she was finally letting her soul exhale after years of holding her breath. The silence was not empty. It was full of presence, of truth, of something deeper than language. On the 10th day there was a closing ritual, a silent walk at sunrise. One by one, each participant followed a winding path through the trees, holding a single candle. No one looked at one another. No one spoke. It was like floating through a dream. When Alina stepped into the circle at the end, her candle still lit despite the wind, she stood with her eyes closed and felt the vibration of wholeness, not because she had arrived, but because she had stopped running. The retreat ended. No fanfare, no summary, just the slow reintroduction of sound, the clink of a spoon, the laugh of a bird, the quiet voice of a woman in the kitchen saying, "Welcome back." But the truth was, Alina hadn't gone anywhere. She had simply come home to herself. She left the sanctuary changed, though nothing had outwardly shifted. She still had no grand plan, no career to return to, no next steps, but she had something more powerful than a plan. She had silence, not as absence but as anchor, as temple, as truth. From then on, even in the noise of the world, she would carry that quiet, because now she knew the temple is always within, and she had learned how to enter. Part 8. Begin again, the sacredness of starting over. Seattle was the last place she wanted to return to, and exactly where she needed to be. The air was colder than she remembered, sharp with city wind and memories. The skyline was the same. Gray towers piercing the mist, cranes dangling midair like unfinished thoughts. But Alina wasn't the same. She had left this city carrying exhaustion in her bones. She had returned with silence in her chest, not as an ache, but as a steady hum. Still, the weight returned the moment she stepped off the train. The kind of weight that clings to your ribs when you revisit a version of yourself you once worked so hard to leave behind. She walked the familiar streets with new breath. Every corner held a memory. That cafe on 3rd where she and Michael once made lists of baby names. The old theater where she saw her last concert before burnout took her voice. The bookstore where she used to escape into other people's stories because she didn't know how to live her own. It was all still here, unchanged, unapologetic. But now, instead of being swallowed by the past, she bowed to it. "You made me," she whispered inside, "but you no longer define me." Her sister, Claire, greeted her with cautious warmth. They hadn't spoken much in the past year. Too many silences, too many conversations that almost happened but didn't. Alina stood on the porch with her backpack and that nervous little smile you give to people you love but aren't sure you still know. Claire opened the door, eyes glossy, and simply said, "You look like yourself again." Alina laughed low and real. "I'm learning who that is." Over chamomile tea at the kitchen table there was no dramatic confrontation, just a quiet unfolding. Questions asked without edge, answers given without defense. At one point, Claire reached out and held Alina's hand for a full minute in silence. That touch healed something years of explaining never could. Later that night, Alina sat on the balcony overlooking the city, wrapped in a blanket and her own breath, and thought. Maybe starting over doesn't mean returning to what was. Maybe it means facing what was while holding space for what could be. She began rebuilding slowly, gently, with intention. She didn't reopen her studio. She didn't announce her return on social media. She simply walked into a small neighborhood community center one morning, offered to teach piano once a week to children who couldn't afford lessons, and said, "I'm not here to impress. I'm here to be present." The director said yes without hesitation. The first student, a shy girl named Layla, reminded Alina of her younger self. Nervous hands, big eyes, afraid to hit a wrong note. Alina sat beside her on the bench, gently guided her fingers to the keys and said, "The music doesn't come from perfection. It comes from permission." Layla played 2 notes, and they were beautiful. Not because they were right, but because they were real. That was the beginning. Alina began planting small roots, not in the soil of who she used to be, but in the soft ground of who she was becoming. She rented a modest apartment above a bakery. The scent of fresh bread became her morning incense. She bought a plant and didn't name it. She joined a library, took long walks without needing to figure things out. Some days were radiant. Others were hollow, but she stopped demanding every day feel like progress. Instead, she let them feel like life. One rainy Thursday, she bumped into an old friend at a farmer's market. They hadn't spoken since her departure. There was awkwardness, of course, but also something warmer underneath curiosity. They talked for 10 minutes, then 15, no deep confessions, just oranges, weather, life. As they parted ways, the friend said, "You seem lighter." Alina smiled. "I stopped carrying what wasn't mine." But not every reunion was gentle. When she saw Michael again, unexpectedly, at a cafe near her old block, her heart stuttered. He was seated at the counter, alone, reading something dense and underlining every third sentence. Just like before, she almost turned around, almost ducked, but instead she walked in, ordered her drink, and sat 2 tables away. He looked up. Their eyes met. Neither of them smiled, but neither of them looked away. After a moment, he walked over. "I didn't think I'd see you again." She looked up, steady and soft. "I didn't think I'd want to come back." They talked for 20 minutes, not about the relationship, not about blame, but about books, places, life. When he asked, "Do you miss it?" she said, "Some days, but mostly I'm grateful it ended. It gave me back to myself." He nodded. They hugged, brief, honest. And when he left, she didn't cry, she simply exhaled. Starting over wasn't a chapter, it was a practice. It wasn't about erasing the past. It was about learning to walk with it beside you, no longer as a chain, but as a companion who taught you what you needed to know and now knows when to stay quiet. She bought a new journal. Blank pages, no prompts, no quotes. On the first page, she wrote, "This time, I begin without needing to become anything other than who I already am." And then, she closed the book. Because not every beginning needs to be recorded. Some just need to be lived. It started with a bridge. Not a metaphor, a real one. An old steel pedestrian bridge spanning across the edge of Lake Union. Alina hadn't planned to cross it. She had wandered there on a Sunday afternoon, drawn by the cool air and the sound of water slapping gently against docked boats. The city buzzed behind her, laughter, music, life, but the bridge was empty. Quiet, suspended in space like a pause between heartbeats. She stepped onto it slowly, her boots clicking against rusted metal, and almost immediately she felt it. Not the wind, not the view, but the heaviness. The kind that gathers in your chest like clouds before a storm, grief. Not the sharp, fresh kind, the old kind. The kind you've swept under memories for years. The kind that doesn't announce itself, it returns, like a ghost with your mother's eyes and your younger self's voice. And Alina, to her own surprise, stopped running from it. She leaned against the railing, looked down at the water, black and rippling. And there it was, a sadness that didn't belong to a moment or a person or a reason. It belonged to her, the girl she used to be, the family that never said "I love you" out loud, the letters she never sent, the songs she wrote and deleted, the conversations that should have happened but never did, the time she wasted pleasing everyone except herself. She had grieved parts of her life in passing, brief tears, quiet sighs, late-night journal entries, but she had never let herself feel the whole grief. The ancient ache, the layered sorrow, the quiet mourning of everything that could have been but wasn't. And here, on this bridge, above cold water and under a gray sky, Alina didn't push it away. She let it come. It wasn't dramatic. She didn't collapse. She didn't sob like a character in a movie. She simply lowered her head, let the tears slip down without wiping them, and whispered into the wind, "I miss what I never had." And the wind answered by saying nothing. Because grief, she realized, doesn't need answers. It needs space. She stayed on that bridge for over an hour, letting the memories come soft and slow, like rain that doesn't ask for permission. Her father's silence, the friendship that faded with distance and pride, the child she once thought she might have, the music she stopped writing, the woman she almost became. And for the first time in her life, she didn't judge the sadness. She didn't rush to transform it into gratitude. She didn't force a silver lining. She simply said, "You're allowed to be here." And in that moment the grief softened, not because it was fixed, but because it was finally welcomed. Later that week, Alina attended a grief ritual at a local center. She sat in a room filled with strangers holding stones, photos, and stories. Some cried, some didn't, but no one apologized for their sorrow. A facilitator read aloud, "Grief is praise, because it means you dared to love." And Alina placed her hand on her heart. She had loved so much. People, dreams, moments, possibilities she had lost, yes, but only because she had lived. Grief didn't leave her after that, it walked beside her. Like an old friend who doesn't speak much but always shows up when the light starts to fade. She stopped seeing it as a failure or a burden. She started seeing it as a bridge, one that connected the surface of her life with the depths of her soul. One she had been afraid to cross for too long, one that now felt sacred, because some wisdom can't be found in joy. Some truths only bloom in sorrow, and now that she had crossed that bridge, she would never be shallow again. Part 10. The Sacred Return, Coming Home to Yourself. It didn't arrive with fireworks. There was no sudden epiphany, no drum roll, just a morning like any other: gray sky, warm socks, the smell of coffee and toast in the air. When Alina realized she no longer felt lost, it wasn't because everything made sense. It wasn't because life had become easier or clearer or quieter. It was because she had stopped trying to escape herself. That was the turning point, the soft miracle, the final return. She was home. Not in a place, not in a role, but in her body, her breath, her presence. After all the countries, all the healing circles, all the bridges crossed and selves shed, she had finally circled back to the beginning. But this time she came back with eyes open. She no longer needed to name the chapter. She no longer needed to explain the journey. She was simply living it. Her apartment, still modest, now felt like a sacred shell, not because it was styled to perfection, but because it held her truth. There were plants growing on the windowsill, books left open mid-read, loose tea leaves in a chipped bowl by the stove. Her shoes were by the door. Her sweater hung over the back of a chair. She belonged here, not because she had earned it, but because she had finally allowed herself to inhabit her own life fully. She started hosting Sunday evenings for a few close friends, candles lit, soup on the stove, music soft in the background. No agenda, no fixing, just being. Sometimes they sat in silence. Sometimes they laughed until tears came. Sometimes they cried and no one tried to stop them. It was enough. They were enough. One night after everyone had gone, she stood by the window, watching the city lights blink like tired stars, and whispered aloud, "This is what peace feels like. Not loud, not perfect, just real." And in that whisper she felt it in her bones. The ache had softened into wisdom. The urgency had become stillness. The question, "Who am I?" had melted into a quiet answer she no longer needed to say out loud. She was no longer the seeker. She was the ground the seeker had been walking on all along. A few weeks later, she was invited to speak at a small gathering, a community circle for women navigating change. She almost said no. Not because she was afraid, but because she didn't want to become someone else's inspiration. But something inside her said, "Go, share." Not to teach, but to reflect. She stood before the room, took a deep breath, and said, "I spent years trying to become something, someone, anything other than what I already was. I thought healing would make me more polished. But it didn't. It made me more present. It made me real, messy, soft, whole. There was silence, then tears. Then a wave of gentle applause, not loud, not performative, but honest. And as she stepped down, someone asked, "So what are you doing with your life now?" Alina smiled. Not evasive, not mystical, just true, I'm living it. That spring she returned to the piano, not as a teacher, not as a performer, just as a woman who loved the sound of her fingers touching keys. She played in the morning, barefoot, hair messy, sun on her face. Sometimes she played pieces she wrote long ago. Sometimes she improvised. Sometimes she played nothing at all, just sat in front of the piano and listened to her own breath. She no longer needed to create to prove she existed. She created because she existed, and that was more than enough. One day she wrote a letter to her younger self and tucked it into a drawer she didn't open often. It read, "You were never lost, just wandering. You were never broken, just buried. You were never too much. You were always becoming. And now, finally, you've come home." The sacred journey of Alina, a full-circle reflection. There was a time when Alina woke up and felt nothing, not numbness, not depression, just an emptiness so quiet it became unbearable. The light from her Vancouver window streamed in like it had every morning before, and yet, on that day, it didn't feel like morning. It felt like the end of knowing who she was, the end of pretending she was fine, the end of holding it all together while silently unraveling inside. But what Alina didn't know then, what she couldn't have known, was that this end was the beginning of something far more profound. Not a comeback, not a reinvention, but a return. Her story unfolded not in grand transformations but in quiet revolutions, in the soft acts of staying, sitting, breathing, and not escaping. She didn't find her healing in breakthroughs. She found it in breaking open, again and again. In Florence, she learned that to become herself, she first had to carve away everything she was not. Watching a sculptor free the figure hidden in marble, Alina realized her identity wasn't something she had to build. It was something she had to uncover. In Santa Cruz, she discovered that grief isn't a mountain to climb. It's a room to sit inside. And pain doesn't want to be solved. It wants to be witnessed, honored, held. Her tears, once a private shame, became sacred water that nourished the roots of her true self. In Vermont, she found that simplicity is not the absence of richness. It is the richness of being fully present with the ordinary. A kettle, a candle, a window cracked open to let in the morning wind. She stopped asking for signs from the universe and started listening to the whispers in her breath. In Sedona, she gave up her obsession with identity. She stopped needing to be defined. Instead, she flowed like the rivers Clara painted, like the creeks she stepped into barefoot every sunrise. She was no longer a name, a job, a status. She was movement, being, not becoming. In the silence of a mountain retreat, she remembered who she was before the world asked her to be someone else. She didn't find her voice there, she found her listening. And in that listening, she met the part of herself that had never left. When she returned to Seattle, the place where her past lived like an old ghost, she didn't run. She walked back into it not to reclaim anything but to stand in her own truth. She cooked soup, played piano, hugged her sister, forgave a lover, but most importantly, she forgave herself. Forgave herself for disappearing. Forgave herself for staying too long where she should have let go. Forgave herself for not knowing better and also for knowing but not yet being ready. And that was her real healing, not in fixing but in accepting the slow unfolding of her becoming. She grieved the girl she used to be, the one who always smiled, always served, always managed. And in doing so, she gave birth to the woman she had always been underneath, soft, strong, wild, quiet, wise. Her journey didn't take her in circles, it took her deeper, not upward, not forward, but inward. And isn't that the real sacred return? Not the moment you find your way out, but the moment you stop running from where you already are. Alina's story is not just hers, it's all of ours. We all carry quiet sadness. We all walk through fogs of forgetfulness, forgetting who we are, why we're here, and what matters most. We chase healing like it's a destination. We measure growth by how far we've moved. We shame ourselves for slowing down. But Alina reminds us of a different truth. Healing is not becoming more, it is remembering you are already enough. Here are a few sacred truths to carry with you, pulled from her path. Stillness is not failure. Sometimes the greatest shift happens when we stop moving, when we sit with what aches, what confuses, what frightens us. Stillness is not a pause in progress, it is the ground of progress. Grief is a form of love. If you're sad, it means you cared, and that means you lived. Don't silence your grief. Let it teach you about depth. Let it walk beside you. The ordinary is holy. You don't need a retreat to wake up. The sacred is in your kitchen, your morning walk, your unwashed dishes. Choose reverence. Choose ritual. You are not a project. You are not something to fix. You are something to feel. You are not behind. You are becoming in your own timing, in your own rhythm. You can begin again always. There is no age limit to starting over. There is no shame in rebuilding. What matters is that you begin again and again and again. When was the last time I let myself sit in silence without a plan? What have I been trying to add to feel better that I may actually need to remove? Is there grief I've never fully let myself feel, and can I let it be real now? What if I stopped trying to fix myself and instead started honoring where I am? You don't need a plane ticket to Florence or Sedona. You need a breath. You need a moment of kindness toward yourself. You need the willingness to feel what you've avoided and the tenderness to love what you find there. Make tea slowly. Fold laundry with reverence. Play music even if you forget the melody. Write letters you never send. Let the rain hit your skin without running for shelter. You are not lost. You are on sacred ground. You are not broken. You are in bloom. You are not alone. You are becoming. If this story touched your heart, if Alina's journey reminded you of your own quiet bravery, if it helped you exhale, soften, or even shed a tear you didn't know you were holding, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support gives us the energy and purpose to create more stories like this, stories that heal, not just entertain, stories that make you feel seen, held, and home. Hit the subscribe button, turn on notifications, and share this with someone who needs to know they are not behind, they are not alone, and they are already enough. Thank you for being part of this sacred circle. This is not the end. This is the beginning again. Welcome home.